And as we're about to kick off, make sure that you stretch, grab some coffee, water, tea, and get settled in as we dive deeper into this topic. Now, before we do that, we are going to introduce our speakers for today. Our first guest is responsible for leading people strategy with the Gilead Sciences leadership team. In her role, she has responsibility for elevating team performance and developing a cohesive approach to attracting, supporting, and retaining employees. Prior to joining Gilead in 2017, she held leadership positions in Novartis Corp in the United States, Europe, and China, bringing a broad international perspective to her work. She currently serves on the board of directors for Lamb Research and California Conference for Women. Please join me in welcoming the Executive Vice President of Human Resources for Gilead Sciences, Jyoti Mehra. Jyoti, it's great to have you here today with us.
Hi, Shelby. It's great to be here. Hello to everyone, and a special hello to those from San Francisco Bay Area.
Woo. I'm from the Bay Area too. Our next guest has worked in the EEO and DEIA arena in the federal government since the end of the last century, both while in uniform as a member of the USAF and as a civil servant. He has worked for the Department of Air Force, US Coast Guard, and NASA in this role. Prior to the workplace shift, he had a long career in the military as an avionics specialist, working on a variety of aircraft and traveling the globe while doing so. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Director for the Office of Diversity and Equal Opportunity at NASA, Frank Gonzales. Frank, it's great to have you here today with us too.
And thank you for having me. Welcome everyone. And I see lots of places I've lived on the chat. So
that's amazing. And for our final guest, he is an Aussie turned New Yorker who coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more, a warm welcome for our co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. David, great to have you here as always, and passing it over to you.
Thanks, Shelby. Good to be back with you and everyone. And excited to have this conversation. There's actually a lot of things I want to learn from Jyoti and Frank, and also from everyone on the line. This is a topic that's really important to me and to many, many organizations. It's really, how do we get, our workplaces right? And it's kind of particularly poignant right now with this whole question of, do we bring people back to the office? And if so, how and when and where and all this. But, it's kind of part of a bigger conversation about just how do we get our workplaces right? And, as a CEO of a company with 200 something people, tiny compared to you guys, but I'm in the same questions. How do we get these, how do we get these practices right? So what I want to do, first of all, is just put a poll up so we can get a sense from the audience here. I see we've got a couple hundred people here, and there's usually more on we're simulcasting on LinkedIn and some other places. But I think the poll's only in Zoom. So let's get the poll up about just kind of what your company is doing with the return to office strategy. So it's kind of these, a lot of stories in the media about, if you're at some of the big financial services firms, they're saying everyone's going to be back in the office, right? Some of the places are saying you can be fully remote forever. Some places are saying, you must be in the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week. That's that kind of fixed amount, that third one. And then some places are saying this is largely up to the individual employee. So what are you deciding? What are you doing there? Let's give you another moment. So we've got about 120 or so. Let's get a few more responses in. What's your return to the office strategy? Interesting. We're seeing the big outlier is the fixed number of days in the office, which is my worst fear. Because I think that is the most logical strategy and the worst strategy, surprisingly. And we might dig into that a little bit as we go on. We call it the sort of 3-2 model: 3 days in the office and 2 days at home. So we'll dig into that a bit. Thanks very much. So yeah, 65% the 3-2 model, 23%. Just making notes of the 65-23% individual. Which I think is probably disclose my bias, I think is the best model. Fully remote, fully in person, both have some interesting challenges, but can work for some companies. Well, let's dig in, with that as a kind of backdrop. Jyoti, let's start with you. And Frank, I might kind of come to you for some input on some of her comments, but kind of we'll do one at a time. Jyoti, firstly, it's great to have you as a guest again. I know you're very busy. The last time we connected, you were very, very, very busy because you running people at Gilead, and you guys were in the midst of like launching remdesivir at the time, and it was kind of we spoke literally about April 2020, the very start of this crazy time. So thanks for coming back, and hopefully things have calmed down just a tiny bit.
Yeah, it's been, yes, I think it's been busy for many of us. And for those of you that don't know about Gilead Sciences it's a research-based biotechnology company here in the Bay Area near San Francisco. We are world leaders in virology, and therefore David's comment about us being very busy through the pandemic. We were the first therapeutics to get approved by the FDA under the emergency authorization use when the pandemic broke out, the fastest ever run clinical trial in the history of medicine. And we were able to get medicines to the market with Veklury, which is an in-hospital treatment for COVID-19. And David, yes, since we spoke, we are really, really proud of the fact that we have treated more than 11 million patients with COVID. And in addition to virology, we're also a company that is making medicines in oncology and inflammation. So really diversified portfolio with 15,000 employees around the globe.
Wow, 11 million people have had their health improved in the 2 years. Congratulations to you guys. That's very meaningful. And 15,000 employees in many, many countries. That's quite a remit to manage. Yeah, it's been quite a time. Tell me, I mean, at a high level, what's the organization doing about work practices? So, looking at those categories, are you kind of a fixed hybrid model? Now that I said that's the worst thing, we're going to have an argument. Or what are you guys doing there, high level, about work practices now?
Yeah, maybe just a quick comment on where we have been pre-pandemic to bridge us over to where we are. So, as I mentioned, we're a biotechnology company, and like many other companies in other industries, we really have a mix of three populations. We have people that are in labs and in manufacturing that never really left offices and the plants. So, I would say a significant percentage of our people are in that population. We still have employees that are customer facing that have never been in offices. So they're out in the fields, customer facing roles. So for them, they've been working remotely from home and with customer engagement. So for them, that looks something differently. And then in the middle is what we called mixed, sort of location dependent roles, meaning they didn't have to be in the office, people like in the G&A functions and others where you could do the role from anywhere. So pre-pandemic, we as an organization had a very heavy sort of in-person culture. As an organization, and coming from other global companies, I would say we were much, much more of an in-person organization, to the extent that I would walk into meetings, there were printed out materials put out. So, there was an expectation that we would all be in person.
Right.
Fast forward, through the pandemic, and we're all still continuing to learn. I wish I could say that we have settled in an equilibrium, and we haven't yet. We have, sort of wanted to maintain some aspects of our culture in the organization, and also a belief that we have at Gilead that there is value in co-location to enable the work that we are trying to do together with lab scientists, together with our manufacturing teams, together with our clinical development teams, et cetera. So coming back from the pandemic, we had some flexibility going into the pandemic. We have what we call Gilead Flexible Policies. We call it GFlex. We have sort of expanded that flexibility. We have not declared specific days that employee needs to come in, but we have said up to 3 days a week, depending on what role you're doing in the organization, employees can choose to work remotely.
Right. So there's some flexibility in there overall. There's not been a decree. Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Jyoti. And tell me what are you seeing about kind of where people want to be? Like, I don't know if you've collected data on this. Like, do people in your organization kind of want to be at home? They want to be at the office. They want to be mixing it up. What do you see from your data?
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of heterogeneity, David. We are seeing lots of different, sort of preferences from employees in terms of how ready they are to come back into work. I will say we only went back again in April. So it's only been a month of, actual data that we have sort of been monitoring, so to speak. I would say that the biggest thing we have seen is April was very slow, partly also because of spring breaks, particularly in the US. But I would say what we're seeing is more than the number of days people are coming in is still low, but more than the number of days, the work pattern has shifted. So we're no longer seeing people coming in, at 7:30, 8 or 8:30 and leaving at 5, 5:30 or 6. They're really working through a different work pattern based on, the traffic patterns, based on their meeting schedules. And
Right.
that's been really fascinating to see. And of course, coming back from the pandemic, like many other companies, we have abandoned any core hours. We don't have core hours anymore within the company that employees have to be at work for certain, 9 to 3 or anything. So that's been an interesting shift.
That's interesting. No core hours. Yeah, I'm curious how many other companies have done that. Maybe just curious, throw in the chat just the words no core hours if your company has done that as well. Just be interesting to see out of a couple of hundred companies here, how many have done that. Just put no core hours in the chat if you're doing that as well. And then I'll come back to you in a sec, Jyoti. I might just, I think, introduce Frank as well, just kind of ask him the same questions, and then we'll dig a little bit further in, because that's an interesting trend. It does give people a lot more flexibility. It just kind of that one decision. Frank, tell us, it's good to have you back as well. I know we had you on the program some time back. Tell us about the kind of work practices that are happening at NASA. And I think you're at headquarters. You tell us about how many people are there, and there's some practices there. Yeah,
we have about 2,000 to 3,000 people at headquarters, contractors as well as civil servants. But NASA pre-pandemic was very telework friendly, very telework friendly. The pandemic just accelerated that dramatically. And coming back, we're not doing like the 3 days in the office, 2 days. 2 days in the office, 3 days telework. It depends on your job. They're just like with Jyoti's organization. We had folks who had to be on site. We're launching people and supply missions to the ISS, and there's still testing going on for some of the aircraft stuff we're doing and satellite, et cetera. So there people had to be on site for those. They never really went away. You can't fix airplanes from your house, for example. It's got to be done there.
not yet.
Yeah,
Robots.
Oh, yeah. Eventually we'll get there, maybe. But yeah, we still had some folks there. As we're coming back, we are generally looking at not necessarily 2 days in the office a week, but 2 days of pay period. So that's basically 2 days over 2 weeks for those who want to telework. But it all depends on your job, your mission, your manager and supervisor, personal preference. If folks want to be in the building, we don't have a problem with that either. Some people like to come into the building because it gives them that definitive break between home life and work life.
Right.
But those who like that, fantastic. I tended to be that way pre-pandemic. I'm kind of, after 2 years, have shifted, and now I have a beautiful vision, as you can see behind me, at my home office. So I kind of like working at home. So I'm working basically 1 day in the office and 4 days at home these days every week to maintain a work-life balance and be able to be a face in the office. And that's going across the whole enterprise, the whole of NASA.
Right.
Those are available to work from home. We're encouraging it, and it's all going to depend on their particular mission.
You're doing a day a week. You're doing a day a week in the office and 4 days a week.
Well, 2 days of pay period. That might be doing Monday, Tuesday on 1 week, work the rest of that week at home, and the whole of the following week. It's just 2 days of pay period. So it's a bit more flexible depending on what their job is, what their needs are.
Interesting. Yeah.
So we're trying to be as flexible as we can, and we're spending the next 6 months or so experimenting, going what works, because we don't know. We're going to a new normal, so we have a whole lot of scientists, as you can imagine, at NASA. So throwing an experiment into there for a few months helps us figure out what actually works.
Let me come back to that, because I want to hear about the experiments you're both doing, because you're actually both in the experimenting business, which is one of the reasons I wanted you here. I actually want to hear about the experiments, but I have to ask a question that's on everyone's mind, especially mine. Is that your background, or is that a Zoom background?
That's a picture of the view from my office window.
But it's not the actual view out the back.
No.
Okay, good. But it is the view you see when you turn around another angle. But okay,
you're getting to see what I'm seeing right now, looking out my window.
That way. Oh, that's even better. Amazing. That's really clever. We love that. So there's some word for that somewhere. It's maybe there's a German word for it somewhere. It's a whole new. You've started a whole new movement. So let's talk about experiments, because that's kind of what I was curious. You both love experiments. What kind of experiments have you been doing, Jyoti? And what have you learned, and maybe what's been surprising from some of the different experiments that you've been trying there in terms of work practices? What can you share there?
Yeah, so for us, we have while we've thought about sort of a general framework, as I was mentioning, of GFlex, which is our flexible work policy, we have sort of left it up to the individual functions based on what roles they have, on how they want to coordinate, people coming into the offices. So one of the things that we have tried to do, and I have tried to do with the leadership team, is trying to, when we're in the offices, trying to build a little bit more time as we think about transitioning from one place to the other. Because really, one of the reasons why we're in the office is that we allow for those bump-ins with colleagues and the connections and the conversations. And what we found in the first few weeks of people coming back is there was, even when you bumped in, because you were running back to back with meetings, there was no time to be able to pause and have a conversation in those connections. So that's one of the things that we have built in. We've tried to automate it through technology, in that meetings default to 25 minutes versus the 30 minutes, which I know many other companies also trying to do, or 50 minutes instead of an hour, so that people have transition time. But more importantly, when they have transition time, there's a little bit of structure built into having those conversations, because that's why people are coming into offices, right? To be able to have conversations between meetings, before meetings, after meetings. So that's one of the things, obviously that we have built in. The other thing, of course, is we have realized that as we think about creating space for connection and creativity, that happens, because people are forming new habits and coming back to work. We're also thinking about how are the ways in which we create those connections and connectivity. For example, we are doing more, in-house meetings, meaning more on-sites versus off-sites, as a way to really bring those together. Gilead, over the last year, interestingly, through the pandemic, we have made tremendous investments in our campus. So we just have inaugurated our Wellbeing Center, which is, again, one of those places where we're trying to run experiments to see, when employees come on site, how do we give them an experience that probably allows them to, again, not just focus on connection and creativity and work with their colleagues, but also focus on their own health and well-being. So we are also running some experiments with our Wellbeing Center and thinking about, how employees are using it, what's of the greatest value to them, really increasing some of the fitness classes and the investments we are making on financial, mental, and physical health of employees.
So you're creating a space people want to come because they have a reason. It's a bit like the retailers of the world. They're trying to work out a reason for people to come in. And kind of that, yeah, that's interesting. How's that going? Are people appreciating that, using that?
It's going really well. I mean, again, early days. And by the way, we had decided to make these investments pre-pandemic, right? But going through the pandemic, it only solidified our desire to continue to make these investments. And partly why we make these investments is we're a healthcare company. We care about the well-being of people around the world. And therefore, we have an obligation to disproportionately care about the well-being of our employees. So connecting it to coming back from the pandemic, it's really been a big plus for us.
Yeah, interesting. That's a really good point. I caught COVID twice. I was okay, but I didn't get the benefit of your wonderful product, but I didn't need it, fortunately. But I discovered through that.
You didn't need it.
Yeah, I discovered through that the joys of hyperbaric chambers, which heal kind of every cell through putting your whole body under oxygen, under pressure, basically breathing pure oxygen under pressure. And it's a really good process. And when we open an office again, I'm going to put one in there, because you can literally sit for 90 minutes with colleagues and kind of catch up while you're healing. It's kind of awesome. So I recommend the hyperbaric chamber in your wellness center. We're going to do one, but that's really interesting, a wellness center. So if you have an extra reason to actually come in, that's interesting. Let's go to Frank. What experiments are you doing at NASA around this, and what's been surprising, and what have you been learning?
Well, one thing we've done is we've made certain all our conference rooms, and we're still working on getting them all done, at least at headquarters, is making them hybrid capable in that people don't have to be in the building to be in the room to be in the room. We've got
Right.
cameras, we've got two-way cameras, we've got the screens, we've got the microphones, et cetera. And we've got folks all over the country and all over the world. So we had a few that were already configured that way. But the new world says, well, let's make them all that way rather than just
Right.
having one or two dedicated. Let's make all our conference rooms that have screens, give them the cameras, give them the speaker systems so folks can get on their platform and their teams and be part of the meeting, even if they're not physically in the building.
Great.
And we've learned to have, I love the drop-ins. That's one of my big things. I like leadership by walking around and saying hello to people and knocking on the door and asking that 30-second question and get that answer. But we discovered we can do that virtually, and we do that a lot. You know, that quick,
Right.
hey, you're free? Can we talk? Great, let's talk. And we get on camera, we talk to each other. And I found in some ways it connected us more. Those of us who are geographically separated found ourselves making time to connect virtually, whereas
Right.
when we're in the offices, we kind of didn't think about those people over on the West Coast or those on the East Coast
Right.
or the South. Now that we've experimented where we weren't really in buildings, we were just available, we do that still. So we still reach out and make those connections,
Right.
have those
Yeah.
conversations. And we've had a health and wellness center in our facilities, in all our facilities for years. People do love those, which is why some folks are coming back to the building to make use of those facilities. And we also want to make sure that everyone talks to their employees and employees talking to their bosses saying, what works for you? And sometimes it's not one side or the other makes that decision. It's got to be the joint decision. Like, this makes sense for both of us.
Right.
The organization needs you in at least once a week because of the nature of your job. Oh, great, you can work there. And we have two different types of remote. We have remote local and remote remote. Remote local is you still live in the area, so you can get in fairly quickly if you needed to get in the building.
Right.
With short notice versus if you lived cross country, for example, or out in Puerto Rico, which is I've thought about moving to, but it'd be a long flight to get to a meeting for an hour and then having to fly back. So I stay in the DC area.
Yeah.
So those are the two options we have, and we have to think through what are the ramifications if you leave the area where your center happens to be located.
Yeah.
To see what those costs would be.
It's an interesting one. I want to dig into that one a little bit more. I want to go back to something that Jyoti said as well, that I think the gap, like the structured gap, so that people are kind of forced to have those interactions. I think that's really important because we do hear that, like, people are coming to the office just in back-to-back meetings. Like, what's the point? You're more productive doing that. You know, if you're going to do that, you're more productive at home. You're not getting that time. You're not getting that walk around time, that reflection time. So I think that's a really, really interesting idea. Frank, one of my career highlights actually at one point, to that point, was actually going into your headquarters in DC and being in your kind of conference room where you could see like a dozen conference rooms on one screen. There's like a checkerboard. You must know it well. But there's this one room. It was very, very high tech at the time, and I had never seen it at the time. But it was literally, you had 10 or something rooms. Each had a really good screen. Each had the sign so you could see where it was. They'd managed the sound well. We tried to do something like that or something similar, and just found it's incredibly hard work. So when we had an office, we closed our office now. We found it took like a year of fiddling, and one of the key variables was just like having a microphone that people would actually speak into properly, because if you can't hear well, it's a problem. And so we found we tested all these different mics. We found the one mic kind of had a long kind of microphone coming up, and then we had we had like a 1 foot rule. You basically had to speak within a foot of that mic, and that kind of became a simple rule to follow. You know, if you're speaking, then be a foot from the mic, right? But I think it's some of those like simple practices we found really get in the way of just, being able to have those meetings. But we ended up kind of realizing that the mixed meetings, you can do it, but they take a lot of technology and a lot of practice. So you don't have side conversations and all this. And generally we'll now have kind of if there's people in a room and people out of the room, we'll all be on a platform so that we can, all be chatting, because there's so much benefit obviously to the chatting. So there's a lot of different angles on that. But let's I was thinking in terms of experiments, just digging in a bit more, like from a theory perspective, we've been thinking a lot about autonomy as a real driver of engagement and motivation. Autonomy is a feeling of control, of having choices. And it's interesting, we had some data on, about a year ago, we had some data that we aggregated from Nick Bloom's great research and from about 10 different companies we're working with and Microsoft's research and all this. And we found that at the time that about a third of people wanted to be in the office, about a third wanted to be at home, and a third wanted the option to, to go back and forward. And we called it the 1/3 problem. It kind of explained a lot of the resistance that was happening, but we just dug into the data again. We did our own research and surveys, and we looked at other people's, and it's actually changed. Very few people actually want to be in the office full time anymore. And like we've seen numbers like 5%, like 10%. When you're talking about a diverse population, particularly African-American, it's a very low percentage of people are wanting to be back in the office full time. Some really like below 5%. So it's interesting. So those numbers have changed, and now the majority of people don't want to be in the office. I think somewhat pandemic related. There's a current wave again. It might shift as that kind of wave passes. But do you both think that that's a trend that is there? We're going to continue to see it. I'm interested, Jyoti, starting with you. Yeah. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to hear you talk about the research, and I had a chance to look at one of your earlier podcasts that talked about the 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. What I find interesting is I wonder if the timing of when we're asking employees these questions makes a big difference too. Yeah. Because I wonder if we had asked this question the week before the pandemic hit, what would we have gotten, right? When people were still in the offices, because I think that was a big transition for people to go from, working in offices, because that was the norm. And now we're on the other side of it, where working from home is the norm for many of us. And therefore, there's a big sort of, it's a big shift. It's a big habit change for us as well. And of course, in my role, I think about not just the timing of that, but the timing of, what does it mean for parents as we are getting to the summer months, right? Where, there is still uncertainty with how to schedule things for the children, all of those, or providing care for elderly, if that's the situation that an employee is in. So I think, I'm more curious as to how, David, you think about the timing of that. But the last thing I would say is as we think about the timing, also we think about the composition of the people that we're asking. At Gilead, we have like 30% plus employees that we've hired in the pandemic. They have never been in the offices. Yeah. And it's interesting what we are seeing amongst those groups, because that's the norm. That's what they have known, that they really sort of, have joined us during the pandemic. So we are, part of the experiments we're trying to do is we're trying to create more of a environment and a high touch approach to how do we actually sort of onboard them. It's a little bit of the next step in the onboarding of bringing, those folks into the offices, because I don't think anybody can argue that everybody has been very productive throughout this pandemic. So the rationale is not to, enhance productivity. The rationale is to build the social capital, to build trust and relationships with colleagues across the organization. But I'm curious, David, how in your research, how do you think about the timing and this shift you're seeing?
Yeah, I think the timing matters a lot. If you measured, obviously, just before the pandemic, just after, you have very different results. But I think, a year into the pandemic, we saw something really different to the end of the second year. I think we're at a lot of people talked about, and I wrote about just kind of how, in hindsight, almost how wonderful the first 6 months were, because it unified everyone. We had a common goal, a common enemy, a focus, and then now there's more kind of burnout and exhaustion in people. So I think it's a lot about who when you ask, and it's also a lot about who you ask. But there is also, I was surprised that it went down to 10%, but it's about 10% of people from our data actually want to be in the office full time. I always thought more did, but I think that if we ask that when the wave passes, that would probably come up to 20, maybe 30%. But I don't know that it's 50%. I would say it's about 20, 30, at the most 40% would be my scientific gut instinct on it, just from watching the trends, who really want to be back in the office full time. But that brings an interesting perspective, because a lot of companies want folks back in, right? Whether it's role specific or not. And I've been talking a lot about kind of how do we give people some autonomy, even in Frank's model. If we're saying you need to be in the office 2 days every 2 weeks, right? That's still kind of like a requirement. It does have a lot of flexibility, but how have you both been experimenting with kind of unexpected flexibility or unexpected autonomy? What kinds of things? I'd love to also hear from people in the chat. Maybe we'll start with Frank, but what kinds of experiments have you done with giving people like more control over their time or work or colleagues or anything? And what kind of results have you seen? Frank, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, in my own office, I mean, the federal government gives a lot of flexibilities, which is nice. One of the things we do is called a maxi flex work schedule, is one of the options people can have, which is you get your 80 hours of work done in the 2-week pay period. You know, it's, as long as you coordinate with your boss, they have an idea where you are and what you're doing. We're looking for results, not necessarily counting minutes. You know, you need to be here from this time to this time. It may be a day that you're busy. I mean, that's the schedule I work. So I might be some days I'm working 10, 12-hour days because I'm also meeting folks on the West Coast. Well, my 6:30 in the morning is definitely way too early for them. But they're comfortable early afternoon ones are kind of late for me. So it's not a problem. I'm going to be on a panel next week, and most of them are going to go through, because it's cross country. They're going through to about 6, 7 o'clock in the evening here on the East Coast. So I'll work longer days those days.
Yeah.
Well, it gives me the flexibility to shrink it on a Friday or take shorter days elsewhere and still get my work done. But we give that flexibility coupled with working 4 days a week at home, or 8 days out of 10 at home, coming in as needed as my boss needs. You know, there are sometimes we go in there just because these are sit in a room together and collaborate and work on some things face to face versus going through Teams or whatever video system you use. But in other cases where your partners are across country, the logistics of trying to find a way to get flights and where you're going to be at, or which coast you're going to be on, are you going to meet somewhere in the middle, whatever it might be, becomes more complicated than just scheduling all-day meeting.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot to get people together. You know, it could be a real lot. It's interesting, you know, some comments in the chat, and I've been watching the chat, some things we'll get to. I mean, I do think people's preference is a couple of factors. There's an introvert-extrovert preference for sure. There are people who are introverts are loving these times, and the people who are extroverts are often, you know, wanting to be background people, or they're heading down to, you know, Starbucks and you know, working there all day. But there are folks who just get energy from being around people a lot more than others do. And there's also a SCARF question, you know, SCARF perspective, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. And, you know, the people high on autonomy, many of them will probably want to be at home. The people high on certainty, it could go either way. People high in relatedness probably want to be at the office. So it'll be a combination of a SCARF profile and kind of introverted, extroverted perspective that's kind of playing out there. But we're kind of curious about the different sort of unexpected autonomy that you're giving people, like the 60-something% of folks who said that they're doing a 3-2 model. Like if you basically say to everyone, hey, you have to be in the office, say 3 days a week, you know, there's only 10% of people who really want to be in the office. And so how, you know, how are you addressing that? What kind of flexibility are you giving them if you are telling them they have to be in the office, you know, 3 days a week? Is there other forms of flexibility that you're giving them? It sounds like no core hours is one. What else are you doing? Maybe put in the chat, or Jyoti or Frank, if you have any ideas, but just curious kind of what other unexpected autonomy are you giving to offset kind of requiring people to be back in?
Yeah, you know, as the chat comes in, so we are, I mean, like probably many other companies, but we're not monitoring or policing. You know, we have, I would say the best way to describe it is we have an overall sort of guidance on how we want employees, you know, to you know, engage with in-person interactions, and at the same time we realize that an employee, for whatever reason, may need additional flexibility. So to me, David, actually, I think that the role of the first line manager or the manager has become more complex and more difficult, because, you know, we are encouraging them to check in with the employees and for employees to get more comfortable with sharing what flexibility they need, right? It's a conversation. And to me, the manager is the one that is straddling between those individual conversations, because back to my comment about the heterogeneity of the individual needs, we want to balance between what makes sense for a person and what makes sense for an organization. We want to balance between, being fair and consistent with meeting the employee where they are. So this piece, to me, really, we have focused quite a bit on, enabling managers to have those conversations. First of all, to create a space where employees can express, whatever flexibility that they need in their work pattern or in their work schedule. But also, sort of talking a lot more about why, right? Because that's been one of the biggest challenges, right? Many of us coming back into work, back to, productivity argument. I don't think anybody can argue that we have not been productive. So really thinking through, why is that important for our culture? Why is that important for the work that we do? But also then sharing those stories back with employees, right? What could we achieve together in a 2-hour meeting that perhaps would not have been as either efficient or as effective in what we could have done online? And we've had mixed reactions, right? We still have employees that, some employees that love those interactions, whether it's because of what they've achieved, or because they're extroverted, or because they've been missing those. And some employees that are still, concerned, either because of their personal situation or because, there's also COVID has not fully settled. So there is a piece around, do I feel safe, right, with optional masking, with perhaps in some cases taking public transportations to come into work? So I do think that we have provided for those flexibility at the individual level through those conversations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a sort of a bit of a kind of dilemma. So, like, on the one hand, there's obviously, I believe there are some benefits to getting together in person. And I want to kind of frame that as the dosage question. And I'll come back to that. So there's this sort of dosage question. Like, there does seem to be a benefit of coming together. Now, whether that's a day a week, a day every 2 weeks, a day a month, a day a quarter, I'll come back to that. But there's this other thing, which is that if you get much more flexible, as Frank was saying, and have people that can be miles away, you can have this really big bump in two things: in the quality of hires and in your diversity. Because basically, if you're only hiring from within an hour of your office, I know where both your offices are, and this is common. You're hiring from high socioeconomic areas, and you're more likely to hire fewer diverse from the diverse population. So you're not necessarily hiring the best possible person. You're hiring the best possible already wealthy person, not necessarily the smartest person for the job. And so whereas if you basically open up and say we hire anywhere, you're much more likely to hire diversely. But the second thing, and we found this because we went fully flexible a few years before the pandemic and said, we're just going to hire the best person wherever they are. It really doesn't matter, anywhere in North America. And we just found we hired completely differently. And we think when we hire, we tend to hire the best person we can. So, we've got our people spread all over the place. And we think that it's improved our hiring massively, and it's improved our DEI. So there's sort of two different perspectives. And now we're trying to reconcile kind of the DEI and quality question with the dosage question. And just literally yesterday, I made an announcement to our couple hundred people where I said, and I'll be curious your perspective, but I basically said, hey, look, I think we've gone too far. We're really good at the efficiency of virtual. We did it for years. We're really, really good at the virtual meetings and this, but I think we went too far away from ever kind of getting together. And I've said, what we want to do is teams ideally should meet once a month and work around each other for 3 days, like a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And the team can work out which month and which location. But, roughly once a month to me feels like a really good amount of time. And if you do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then people have to travel in, can do that without, destroying everything. So, and then kind of quarterly, maybe we do a week where lots of the teams are in one place. And so you're getting more of that interaction quarterly, and maybe we have some specific retreats and things then. And then also you have kind of teams getting together for more learning, for learning experiences. Although I want to come back to learning in a minute, because it actually, in many ways, works better virtually than in person. But that's, so we're trying to reconcile the sort of dosage question with the, the sort of letting people be anywhere. And we've landed on just spending a bit more on travel and trying to say, hey, teams, get together about once a month, work around each other, and let's see what happens. That's our experiment we're about to unpack. What are you guys doing in that space? What's your thoughts, Jyoti?
Yeah, so so for us, maybe it's worth articulating. Pre-pandemic, we didn't have a huge remote workforce. So we had less than 3% of our employees were remote, but also not a very clear sense of why are those roles remote. We have expanded the aperture on that very much. And we have said there are certain kind of jobs for which co-location doesn't matter. And in our field, one of the examples that I often use is a medical writer. A medical writer can sit in any part of the country, in any part of the world, and do their job. But if you are a researcher, you sort of kind of have to be in the lab, right? And our lab locations are in Foster City, but our manufacturing plants are everywhere. So I think for us there is so there is that piece. The other piece, I think, David, my view is, I think how many times you need those interactions are very contextual. If you are a brand new team, and many of the leaders are new on a team, I do think that you need to have some concentrated amount of interaction to be able to set up the relationships for success. I think it just accelerates your own journey as a team if you have those upfront. And I'm not sure whether it's 1 day a week, whether it's 3 days a week, whether it's 2 days a month. I really think it's contextual, both on where your teams are, where your organization is, but most importantly, what's the kind of work that you're doing together and what's the right setup for that work, right? So that's sort of, how we are thinking. And that's why we haven't mandated it. Actually, it's interesting. We're just coming off of 2 days of our in-person meeting with the top 200 leaders at Gilead. And, lots of, again, it was hybrid, right? There were people, for example, living in China that couldn't travel for the meeting, right? Or people even within the United States that unfortunately either had COVID or came in contact with somebody who had COVID that couldn't be there. So we really upped the technology where people could actually have more of an immersive experience. We actually had leaders, including myself, do virtual networking session because we didn't want people to feel like just because you're not in person, you can't network with, leaders and colleagues. So we're trying to find different balance, but I think the frequency, the dosage question of yours, I think will be very contextual.
Yeah, very contextual, and it's an interesting one. Frank, do you have any comments on this? Some interesting questions as well coming in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, NASA's got a core value of inclusivity, so we're an inclusive organization. But we've had teams that were remote before COVID. Our aeronautics centers, we have 5 separate aeronautics centers in NASA, plus folks at headquarters. So that team could be in 5 locations. So they've had to work in a virtual realm, and travel happened on occasion as necessary. Sometimes you got to physically put your hand on the airplane or the new motor or whatever it might be to get up close and personal, see what the problem may be or what the risks and mitigation efforts are. And we've realized that we've been doing this for a while, so it wasn't a huge shift, except going to everyone who could work from home now needed to work from home thanks to the pandemic. And it shifted. I was one of those people who enjoyed being in the office because it gave me that commute was get my day started, get to the office, work, finish my day. The commute coming home was the dump work and go back into my relax mode. I've learned how to do that in a virtual environment. I have a little reminder pop up end of the day saying go home.
Right.
On my calendar that lets me know, okay, time to start shutting down and make that transition. So there are ways to do it, but when you've already got a very reasonably inclusive, diverse organization, and we've got people who work for headquarters who've not been to DC in years. We hire from all over the world. It's just, do they want to come to DC if they want to be at headquarters or not? Virtually, we now starting to have people work at our different centers and would be what we call badge at those centers. They may not be actually showing up there on a daily basis or a weekly basis, but that's where if they need immediate support for tech and things like that, that's who they would contact because it's closer. If you live up in Portland, Oregon, you're probably going to go to our AIM Center in Silicon Valley as your closest office to help deal with those issues that pop up you need help with. But we want to make certain it works for both sides because we want to keep good talent. We are competing with Gilead and Amazon and Google and SpaceX and so on and so forth for top talent. we've got some cool stuff in that space fact and
Yeah.
loved, but we want to make sure that we give them the tools so we can be competitive and get those people to help us make it better for the world. So it's a balancing act we have to do.
It's a balance, absolutely. I want to address some of those points actually. Just a quick a comment about training, as I saw a question come up in the chat, and we just recently did some research on this and published a piece in Fast Company that has been making the rounds. So we actually did some research on how many people built real habits coming out of a learning experience. Because for us, when we do learning, it's habit activation. We care if people are doing this regularly, weekly now. If you're making people more inclusive or less biased, you should see real things they're doing every week. So we measure those habits, and what we found is that a well-designed virtual experience was about 50% better at building habits than an in-person experience. And that's not taking into account at all the incredible difference in cost and scale and speed. So, if you've got 1,000 people you're trying to train to be more inclusive, for example, and you want to do it virtually, you can do that in 30 days. They can be anywhere in the world. You can do it in 30 days. You have 1,000 people, you're trying to do it in person. It's going to take you a year, 2 years, an extraordinary amount of cost. And the interesting thing is you'll never get to that 1,000 people because there's such turnover that you never actually get the mass. But not accounting for any of that and the cost in it, we actually found that the virtual experience just on habits was 50% more effective. And we had an incredible case study we've been talking about a lot, where a company of 140,000 people was able to touch 96% of their population in a really meaningful way that really changed how people interacted in 1 month. And a completely voluntary program, not mandatory at all. 96% of 140,000 people. So there's ways, learning. We believe this is a great opportunity to make learning much more virtual, but make sure it's good virtual learning. There's ways to make virtual learning really, really work, and there's ways to do it terribly. But if you do it well, compared to doing in-person learning well, you actually should see a much, much better result overall. So that's something that we continue to talk about. There's a really important question I think coming in. I'd love to hear Jyoti and Frank, your perspective on this. I'll just share mine briefly first. About people are asking, how do you go, push back on a leader that says we want everyone in? And I think we should literally write an article with that headline. How do you push back on a leader that wants everyone in the office? We should write a piece exactly on that. There we go. Amelia says, let's do that. Hope my content team's listening. So, the essence of this is they're going with some biases, right? The bias they're going with is an expedience bias, which is it feels right, so it must be right. And it's one of the 5 big biases. Also a little bit of an experience bias. But also what they're doing is they're feeling, and what's driving this bias is a sense of certainty. And it just feels like it's easier to understand. It feels more certain, more predictable. And, feeling something is more certain is a strong reward response, and feeling something is uncertain is a threat response. And we're driven to avoid threats and increase reward. So, you're basically saying to a leader, hey, let's dive into more uncertainty here, versus the leader saying, hey, what a great chance to make things more certain. So, you can see how it might be beguiling to, increase certainty. It also increases the leader's sense of autonomy, because the leader now feels more in control, right? And the sense of autonomy is very important. It also increases the leader's sense of status. As they walk around, they can see their people, and also their sense of relatedness. So, you've got 4 of the 5 things that matter to people from SCARF are up for leaders. What you got to remember is that those same, 3 of those same things are down for the employee. So the employee, if told to come back in the office, sees it as a status threat, an autonomy threat, and to some degree a certainty threat, but in a big way, a status and autonomy and a fairness threat. They're often being more productive at home, and they're told they've got to, waste 2 hours a day, 10 hours a week. So you've got these big threats, and basically, like a fairness reward and a fairness threat are not equal on a seesaw. If it's a fairness threat, it's much heavier. Right? Same with autonomy, like giving people a little bit of autonomy is a nice positive, taking away some autonomy, big negative. So the negatives are really, really strong. So these leaders are getting these, nice, subtle, positive bumps of certainty and autonomy and status and relatedness, but the employee is getting these really big drops in autonomy and status and fairness. And it's much heavier for, there's a lot more threat response for the employee. So that's one way to understand it. And then of course there's this really interesting research that is showing up that some people are more productive in the office. Or certainly the people who say they want to go to the office, they're saying one of the main reasons is because they're more productive there. And that's from a Microsoft study, and some other people are finding that. Like generally people are choosing office because it's more productive, but not everyone. You do certainly waste a lot of time on that. But there's a lot of people who just can't work at home, or for various reasons, or they just work better at the office, right? Lots of people work better at home. And if you basically take that choice away, you're also losing the positive bump of feeling in control of this choice. And it turns out that feeling in control of a choice has a very strong positive bump in and of itself. And I mean, there's studies from way back showing it was halving the death rate in a retirement home, in an aged community, like giving people 3 trivial choices, literally halved how much they died each year. There's lots and lots of different animal studies and human studies and cubicle studies, all sorts of things showing that just the act of giving people a choice is intrinsically a very rewarding thing. And the act of taking it away is a very intrinsically demotivating thing. So, so you put all this together and you say, it's kind of, the certainty is visible, like seeing people there, not having to think about stuff, that's visible to you, but the costs might be invisible. And the best data I can see so far is about 2/3 of people are saying they'll look for another job. Doesn't mean they will take it, but about 2/3 of people right now are saying they'll look for another job if required to go back to the office. And so we're seeing quite a lot of data coming out about that kind of thing. So, there is a war for talent happening. And I think we're going to need to be, I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. I think we're going to continue to need to be really flexible. While of course, to Jyoti's point, if you've got a lab, you need people in the lab. There are some people who are going to have to be on site. But maybe how do we give them some unexpected autonomy in some way over the hours or practices or something? Jyoti, Frank, what are your comments on that?
Go ahead, Frank.
Okay. Yeah, I think, to go with the question, like, how do you persuade leaders? Depends on where they sit. If it's the person at the very top has said, we want to look at making the most flexibility, you've got your, the 2x4 to get the lower leaders' attention. When they say, no, I want everyone in, well, the big boss said otherwise. If it's the big boss saying coming in, that's a whole different conversation you've got to have. And while it may make all their values go up, like, yeah, I'm feeling great, I can see my team, I can look down and see my kingdom. Problem is they can leave. Your kingdom can shrink quickly, especially in today's model where people got options. And when you have high unemployment, people are going to stick around. When you have the seller's market is now the employees, they can take their talents elsewhere. And if there are plenty of people out there saying they have no problem taking a lower salary if they can have more autonomy in their life. And we see that when we have folks work remotely, the federal government has this thing called locality pay, which shifts your pay based on where you live. And people are leaving some high expensive areas like San Francisco, DC, LA, et cetera, and moving to lower cost areas, seeing their salary drop, but they're happy because they're getting to work remotely. They can work from home. So with those circumstances going on, it isn't necessarily the money. It's not necessarily the prestige. It's the autonomy they're getting. Finding that balancing act becomes more complicated, but leaders need to understand, do you want to drive your folks away or do you want to be inclusive? How do you include those people? How do you make your connections and shift out of your comfort zone and get a little bit out of your comfort zone to help bring them into theirs? And then make those connections, have a more effective, inclusive work environment. And I saw some of the comments. There are people who have medical needs, have disabilities that may make it difficult to come into the office on a regular basis. There are those who are concerned because of the COVID and the pandemic who have medical issues that make them more susceptible to catching something. And they've been the healthiest they've been in 2 years because they've not had to deal with people for 2 years.
Right. The introvert germaphobes are having a great time. The introvert germaphobes are having a great time. They're very happy. And
and I'm one of those people. I used to like going in. Now I'm quite happy. I did move to a new house, and I do have my own office now set up here versus sharing with my wife in my old home. Now I got my own personal one. It's become more effective. I get a lot more done at home than running around. Now, of course, there's the downside is we're having to tell people to schedule those virtual meetings with some breaks there. My
Right, 25 and 50-minute meetings. Yeah, 25.
Yeah, give me a bathroom break once in a while, or give me a chance to go top off my water or my caffeine is a useful tool. But the first year of pandemic, we were going back to back to back to back to back. And then people were showing up late because they just couldn't get from one meeting to another.
Yeah. No, you need the 25 and 50-minute meeting for sure. It's really important practice.
So we're doing that more. But yeah, that's what the next 6 months for us is going to be.
Yeah.
The experiment. What's the balance that works for the most people? And that's what we're trying to get to.
Thanks, Frank. I want to give Jyoti a minute to just wrap up, and then we'll let people go. Folks, before you jump off, there's a little poll to know kind of how to help you and how to follow up. Just maybe my team can put that up. I just noticing the time. So I know some people need to drop. So maybe we can put the poll up as we go to Jyoti, your closing comments. What are your reflections as we wrap up from your point of view?
No, I would just add, I think you've beautifully summarized it, David, in your SCARF model. I think that kind of hits the nail on the head. The last piece I would say is, I know this is a difficult conversation sometimes for individuals to have. So as much as, we encourage managers to share why, when we want people to be in offices or in a meeting in person, why is that important? But I also think the other side works, right? As an individual, let's talk about why we may need flexibility. And I think sometimes just having a more human conversation about that, as opposed to thinking about what is your flexible work policy and guideline, can make the discussion just injecting the human, I think I know it's easier said than done, but that would be my encouragement.
Yeah, no, let's come back to the human for sure. I mean, I think we have a program called Flex that we built in the last year, kind of giving people managers the key skills, and it's solve for autonomy, manage for fairness is the first thing. Like solve for autonomy and then manage for fairness. But the way to solve for autonomy is asking a lot of questions, like find out what people really need and have that really human conversation with them to see where they are and what's going on. We should wrap up. Jyoti, thank you so much for coming back. Great to see you. You look calmer.
Pleasure to be here.
On top of things. Congratulations on the great experiments you're doing. We're going to think about a wellness center at NLI. And
thanks for having me back, David and team.
Great to have you, and Frank as well. Great to have you back. Thanks for sharing your inspirations and inspiring us all to get a Zoom background with what we can see. We love that as well. And I'll hand back to Shelby for some announcements. Thanks so much. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Shelby. Back to you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciated it. We have some big news to share. So with summer coming up, we know the season gets busy with PTO, traveling, and many organizations implement summer Fridays. So to accommodate that, we are going to be shifting to a new day on Thursdays at noon, starting next week on May 26th. So your Brain at Work Live will be on Thursdays at noon until the end of summer. And that is just to accommodate you all. And we want to stay connected to our community while traveling and everything is happening. So that's just something we wanted to share quickly. We thank you for attending today. As always, staying engaged. If you have any insights, we have a survey for feedback. Insider exchange, again, just a reminder, specifically for senior executives, if you enjoy your Brain at Work Live, this is a facet of that where you can connect with our leadership team and talk about new solutions and help us look at research and have conversations. So to apply, follow that link. We will have a product demo next week on Select, Wednesday, May 25th at noon. So if you're interested in learning more, check that out. We're also hiring, as always. We want you to join us. So visit neuroleadership.com/careers to learn more about our open positions. Summit is on the horizon, Summit 2023. Keep that on your minds. If you enjoyed today's conversation, check out our podcast, Your Brain at Work, wherever you listen to your podcast. And this is officially where we say farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes,